What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Home Built Workshop. Today I got something really fun and exciting. We're gonna do some leather work and I'm gonna make this really cool custom leather tool pouch that's gonna hold some of my tools and things that I'm gonna use when I'm running the chainsaw mill. So stick around, check it out. So if you guys saw my recent video about assembling the Granberg chainsaw mill, you will already know that I've gotten into milling up my own slabs and lumber, and man, I am really enjoying this process. Now, in the short amount of time that I've had the mill up and running, I've discovered that there is a core set of tools that you're going to use for making adjustments, setting up the rails, making sure things are nice and level, and I want a way to have those tools on my body while I'm making those adjustments. And I think this leather pouch we're going to build is going to work really cool. Some of the things that I've identified are a level, a few wrenches, there's an Allen wrench for adjusting the handle. For now I'm going with a Sharpie. I'm going to probably upgrade that maybe to a lumber crayon or something like that. Of course, the wrench for the saw, and a bunch of these wedges. Now, like I mentioned, these could all be put in some sort of a small toolbox and kept nearby, but I want to try to keep these on my belt so that I don't even have to get up. I can just reach in, grab what I need, do what I need to do, and keep on milling. Now, I have spent a fair amount of time making some drawings, some mock-ups, just trying to figure out a pattern that I believe is going to work well. And I think I've come up with a plan that's going to work pretty good. I'm not 100% sure how some of the operations are going to go because I can only mock up so many things at a time. But this is kind of the layout that I'm going to go for first, and then we're going to have another layer on top with a large pouch to where a couple stacks of these wedges can live. So let's get some leather out and start making some cuts. I picked up this piece of leather at my local leather supply place. I think it's going to be plenty big enough to make this pouch, and I'll even have some leftovers for hopefully some other cool projects down the road. My first order of business is going to be to cut everything to the rough size. I'm using a straight edge to help me get nice straight cuts. These are all going to be cut to just a rough size at this point. Now I can begin laying out some of the curved cuts and some of the other little details of the pouch. I found this roll of tape makes the nice perfect curve. Alright, so there is the main shape. This will end up getting folded around with some snaps. So now this next piece is going to be the inner pocket that's going to hold all of the small tools, and then we're going to put an outer larger pocket on the outside. The main reason that I've left this oversized is honestly I don't know exactly the size that I needed to cut it. I need to wet mold this roughly to a few of the tools, so I just stayed on the safe side, left this thing wide, and then we'll trim it down once we get it molded. I've also done the same thing with the piece that's going to make the outer pocket. I've left it way bigger than it needs to be. I'm not worried about that at the moment. Once we get it molded to shape, then I can trim it down. With the tools laid out on my template, I'm going to cover everything with some plastic wrap. That's going to protect the tools and my template from the wet leather. Just going to soak that piece of leather in the water for a minute so it gets nice and pliable. After a few minutes in the water, this leather is nice and pliable now. I think this is going to work good. And now I can line up the soggy piece of leather with some marks on my template. I'll roughly work everything into shape before clamping it down. I'm going to use a couple of old towels as a clamping caul. I'm hoping that the towels are going to press in around the tools to act as a little mold. Just having the weight of this plate on the top, I can see the leather starting to conform a little bit. I'm going to utilize the clamps in my T-tracks to put a little bit more pressure down on it. I will see what happens. It's conforming a little bit. I wish I could get it to squeeze down in there a little better. Probably should have made somewhat of a wooden form. It probably would have been a way better idea. But it's going to give me a little bit of an idea of where things are going to land. And worst comes to worst, I can always wet that again and kind of form it a little bit better once we get farther along. So let this dry for a little while. Oh, that thing's heavy. Cool. I just needed a rough outline, someplace where I can see where I need to add some stitches. And now I'll just use a scrap of wood while the leather is still a little bit wet and fine-tune the pockets a little bit. And now we can form up the piece that's going to be the outer pocket to hold the wedges. I'm going to put just a small scrap of leather in between the wedges just to give me a little bit more width. I don't want the pocket to be too tight. Then I'll wrap the wedges in plastic and clamp the wet leather around it. So now that I have this clamped up and drying, I believe I'm going to move back to this portion. We're going to use some contact cement and glue this guy together so we can start doing some stitching. I'll temporarily clamp the two pieces together so that I can flip it over and scribe a line that'll mark the outer edge. This will give me a line so I know where to apply the glue. I just made a mistake. We're going to come back to that. So what was the mistake that I mentioned I made? Well, I intended to dye these pieces before I started putting it together. I just got ahead of myself, got in a hurry, and wanted to see this thing starting to come together. This isn't going to make any difference with the project. Before I stitch it, I can still get down in there, so I'll still be able to get some dye down in there. Right now, I need to do just a little bit more wet molding to get all the pieces together, and then we're going to put some dye on this. So I'm going to use this to mold a couple of pieces that I'll be able to stitch on later. Since I want these pieces to be a nice snug fit, I'm going to cut out a quick form out of some plywood that I'll use to clamp everything down. Shake well before using. Actually, you're supposed to shake it? Huh. That's a good question. Doesn't say anything about it. Now that I've got this dyed, I can begin stitching. I'm going to stitch in between each of these slots where the tools are going to go. That's going to help keep everything secure in their little pocket. I'm just going to start using the little punch, start punching these holes, and then we can start stitching some thread in there. I'm using some waxed thread and a saddle stitch for all of the stitching on this pouch. There's one. There we are. First round of stitching is complete. Now I'm going to set this guy aside and we're going to work on the pocket that's going to go on the front. On the outside of the pouch, I want to have some little holders for things like this scrunch and maybe some other items. Also on the front, I want to add this little clasp, someplace I can clip on, like maybe a logging tape measure or something. I'm not quite sure yet, but I can see it coming in handy. When I was playing around with the fitment of these, the head of this wrench does not slide all the way down just because it sticks out a little bit farther. So I need to build up some thickness on the back of this pieces. So I'm going to cut a couple of pieces that are the exact same size as these. That's going to build it out away from the pocket, and then I can glue and stitch those on the pocket. For the little buckle, I'm just going to cut some scraps, a little strip that I can loop through here, stitch that guy on, and we'll be good to go. Just do a little bit of dye touch up here real quick. Guess we ran out of gloves. I tried to save the one that I had left, but somebody tore it. Who says you can't use a belt grinder for leather? It actually works really well to flush up the edges and round the corners. Now I'll use a beveling tool to put a nice bevel on the edge of the leather, and then I can go about touching up the dye. And now I'll finalize the edge by wetting the leather with some water and then using a slicker to burnish the edge. And I'll repeat that process on the piece that's going to hold the metal clasp. Now when I put this strap on here, this clip will slip on. I'm going to add a couple of snaps up here. That's going to allow me to change out the clip for something else, or maybe even offer some other way of attaching something should I need it down the line. So now I'm just going to punch out for a couple of snaps and we'll get those installed. This is really easy to do. I'm just using one of these little hand punches. Now with the holes punch, I'm not going to install the snaps at this moment. I'm going to go ahead and get everything glued onto the pouch, and then we will use these existing holes to locate where we need to punch the other holes. And now I can punch the holes and stitch these pieces in place, starting with the strap. One thing that I have found is that if you don't have a stitching pony, hand screw clamps can work really good as a pretty decent substitute for a stitching pony, but I do see myself making a stitching pony sometime in the future. So right now, I'm gonna get this stitched up and then we'll come back and add these snaps. I'm gonna use the holes that I already punched to mark the location of the other side of the snap. I have to use a different style of punch for these holes because I can't get in there with the rotary punch. I'm just using a really simple snap setter, nothing fancy here. You can pick these up at leather supply shops. It's just kind of a little die and then a punch that's shaped specifically for the snaps you're using. So with the snap set, I am now done with all of the work on the two separate pieces. It is now time to join these together. For that, we're gonna break out the contact cement, a lot more punching and a lot more stitching. So let's finish this thing up. We are almost done. I'm still hand sanding, even on a leather project. Now I just need to mark out my stitch line. To do that, I'm just using a compass, but instead of marking with the pencil, I'm scratching a line with the sharp point. And now, a whole lot of punching. It's kind of tricky punching through 3 layers of leather, but we got through it. And now I need to stitch all the way around the outside of this pouch. This took quite a bit of time because I was stitching through 3 layers of leather. I found I had to grab a pair of pliers quite a few times to help pull the needles through. I'm starting the last stretch. This is taking a really long time. Done. The last thing I'm going to do is just apply a little bit of neat's foot oil. That's going to help condition and protect the leather. I almost forgot the most important part. Ha! And now I can just load this thing up and try it out. The pockets are nice and snug. Those will break in a little bit more as I use this, but I am really happy with the way everything fits. Bam! Man, I like that. I am really happy with the way this turned out. This thing looks amazing. Really proud of this one. Now, just in case you guys are wondering why I made this flap with the snaps instead of some sort of a belt loop, my intent is to wear these on my chainsaw chaps, and they don't really have a good belt system, so I want to be able to just snap these on there. I think it's going to work out just fine. I'm really, really happy. Looking forward to putting this thing to use. Thanks a lot for following along with this project, guys. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed putting it together. Let me know down below in the comments what you thought of this project. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next time. Incoming. Gonna be over here sniffing some glue for a few. Don't sniff glue, kids. It's not good for you. Seriously.